how many of you know where your great-grandparents were born? 1, 2, okay, a few of you. Do you know how they spent their lives? What they did for a living? And do you know what talents and skills you might have inherited from them? I've been interested in my forebears for most of my life, actually. When I was a 7-year-old girl, my baby brother was born, and as a little present from some friends of the family, he got this little baby book, and right at the front of it, there was a little family tree. And it showed my brother, his parents, which obviously is my parents too, grandparents, and then above that, great-grandparents. I thought, oh, I don't know these great-grandparents. So I knew people in the beginning of the tree, but I've never heard of all these other people. So I asked my parents all about them, and I remember being really, really disappointed that none of these people were still alive. And I was thinking, I wish I could have met these people, because I'd never thought before that my parents had grandparents just like I did. So when I was older, I decided to do a bit of research to find out more about these people. And what I want to do is to share the story of just one of those people, my mother's great-grandmother, Kate. In fact, Kate Mary Clay is her name. So to start my search, I went to find out her birth certificate. Now there's various ways you can do this, but years and years ago, the only way to get copies of English birth certificates was to go down to London, a place called St Catherine's House. And there you search through these huge big index books, and if you have a rough idea of when the people were born, you look in that year, and there in the index you'll see the name of the person you're looking for, and then you can go and order a certificate which is then posted out to you. As you can see here, we find out that Kate was born on, and you can see that 25th of March 1865, 25 Star Street, which is a place in London. And her father, John Francis Clay, that's his potman. It was actually another word for barman, so he used to work at a bar. And her mother was Eliza Clay. Now sadly, I later discovered that Eliza died of something called phthisis from confinement about a month after Kate was born. And even more sadly, her father, John Francis, died of consumption just over a year later. Now these are both old terms which basically mean pulmonary tuberculosis, and obviously the conditions in London at the time contributed to that. So they died, leaving 3 young daughters alone in the world, with no family. Both their grandmothers had been widowed. John's mother, Elizabeth, already had 2 young children of her own, so she couldn't look after them. Eliza's mother, Sarah, was already in her late 60s, living with her older daughter. So what happened to Kate Mary Clay? Well, my mother had always understood that the girls were looked after by their aunt, Elizabeth Alexander. However, I discovered at the time that Elizabeth Alexander was a single woman working as a milliner to earn her living. So when I went to look at census returns, these are returns that are made every 10 years, and you probably all have to fill in census returns yourselves. You have to give your name, all the people in your household and your occupations. Now these records from the 19th century give a lot of information to people who are looking into their family. And when I looked at the 1871 census, I discovered that Kate was actually living in an orphanage in Woodmanston, a little village in Surrey. And you can see her there, Kate Mary Clay, and there's the matron of the orphanage, and she's listed as scholar. So she's never known her parents, and she's staying in an orphanage. So what happened to her after that? My next glimpse of her life was 10 years later, and I discovered she's still in Woodmanstone, but she's now living in a schoolhouse, and she's a pupil teacher. So this was a common way in the 19th century for teachers to get a training. They went in as pupil teachers, so that they were learning and training up as teachers at the same time. And prior to the Education Act of 1902, the aim of this system was to provide a continuous stream of suitably qualified public elementary school teachers. So Kate was training up as a teacher, and 10 years later, we find that she's moved to Yardley. And you can see Louisa Clay, Kate Clay, school teachers. So they've now, actually, my mother found out later, they were the first teachers at this primary school in Yardley. However, she didn't stay in Yardley. She actually got a job as a governess back in Woodmanstone, and the family that she was working for also had a gardener, Frederick Flack, which was my great-great-grandfather, and she married him, and they settled down in Woodmanstone. And 10 years later, we can see them living there. Frederick Flack, Kate, and they had 2 sons at that stage, Frank and Stephen. Their first child was actually a daughter, who sadly died young. And then my own grandfather was born a couple of years later. So I've learned a little bit about Kate's life. My mother had very fond memories of her grandparents that she often visited as a child. And her grandfather worked as a gardener and passed on his love of gardening. My grandfather and my mother were both keen gardeners. And what about Kate? Well, I think she's passed on some of her skills. My mother was a school teacher. And as for myself, when I first graduated 25 years ago, I worked at the Leeds School of Economics, and I spent about a year teaching maths to economics students. So maybe I've inherited some of Kate's teaching skills. And that's just a picture of my mother with her grandparents, Kate and Fred. And finally, I was able to piece together a family tree for Kate. And that's what I've discovered about her. And I've learned a bit about a very interesting person. So I hope you maybe be inspired to find out a bit about your great-grandparents. Thank you.